Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. This is going to be a pedal build. I've got a kit of a Big Muff Pi. This is from DIY Guitar Pedals. Awesome guys over there. Highly recommend their stuff. They sent this over to me, and I was pretty excited to put this thing together. Big Muff Pi is a sweet circuit, and I'm excited to get cracking on this thing. So, I want to talk a little bit about some of my processes for building kits, some of the stuff I've learned over the years, and we want to relay that to you guys. Everybody's kind of got their own little ways of doing things, but this is just kind of how I do it. I break it into a couple different steps. First would be populating the PCB, and then second would be any work that would need to be done on your enclosure to get it ready to go. So I've got to drill some holes, and I got to mount some components and do some finishing work if I so desire. My girls kind of helped me with this paint job. It's kind of weird, but it is kind of cute that they did it. And then kind of the last step would be marrying the two. So you've got your components in there, and you got your circuit board here, and you got to kind of wire it all up together. So I'm going to start with the PCB. Just a couple of thoughts that I have is I tend to, so you just kind of want to think it through a little bit. Depending on how hyper-organized you are, when you're putting your resistors in, one idea you could do is if you can read the capacitor, or the resistor codes here with the color coding, that'll tell you what the value is. You can actually put those in so that they read left to right, like as if you're reading a book, and it matches the PCB layout. That's a really nice way to do it. That makes it easier to debug in the future, and you can, if you're quick at reading those, doing the mental math, then you can kind of just glance through, and especially if you're presenting this board on a forum for somebody to help you fix it, that's a nice way. They're not trying to figure that out, which way is left or which way is right every time. But the other thing that I do is I've got my multimeter up here, and what I really like to do personally, this is just something that I started doing when I was building amps, but you're doing quality control at the same time as you're populating your PCB. Now, this kit came with a bunch of little baggies full of resistors and capacitors and all different things, and they're marked. This one says 150, so I believe that's 150 ohms, and I could take that at its word, but it's also just a good idea to double check that. And so I actually stick it in my multimeter, turn it into resistance mode, and measure it. So I don't really even care which one I grab, I just measure it. This one measures at 146.5, so it's a little bit out of spec, but within tolerance. Then I go over to my bill of materials, which I've got up on my computer, and after reviewing that, I see that R11 is 150 ohms. And so I've double checked that this resistor is the correct value. And now I can put it in with confidence, knowing that this is exactly as it should be. And then I don't really have to muck around with reading the resistor codes. I mean, I could if I wanted to, but I really don't need to because I've already double checked. I know for a fact that this resistor is correct. So I can feel confident in that. And I tend to just do it all at once. Like I do all the resistors at once. And then at some point you want to start soldering them in, but if you want, you could put all the components on the PCB and then solder them all up. I just find that gets a little bit messy, so I break it up a little bit. So again, I'm just pulling out a resistor, sticking it into my multimeter, and it tells me that this is 2.7K, 2.68K. And I can look over at my bill of materials. I can tell you that R22 is 2.7K. So I'm just going to keep doing that. On and on we go. Now I'm going to wire up these resistors before I move on to anything else. And one thing that I do is, I'm using 6040 rosin core solder. That's just what I'm pretty comfortable with. I like these kind of nice thin beads of solder. Then you can really control how much is going on. I mean, you don't really need a lot of solder to go into each of these little points. And then I've got this little pencil tip soldering iron, but the nice thing about it is it has a variable heat control down here. And it says it goes from 200 degrees to 450 degrees. And I really like that because in the past, I have had troubles especially if you're not so confident in your skills, you can really nuke these things. If you're using like 400 or 450 degrees on your soldering iron, you can really nuke these boards and cause a problem. And there are some components that might be a little bit temperature sensitive. And so you just kind of want to be mindful of that, of your heat. You obviously need to get enough heat that you can flow the solder reasonably well. But if you get too much, it can get to be a problem. So finding just that right balance with this temperature control is really nice. And basically, I'm just going to go through and I just put a tiny little bit of solder on my tip just to get things kind of ready to go. And then I try to actually contact the position. So if I'm going to do this one right here, I want to get so that there's heat touching both the pad and the leg. And that way you get direct heat transfer. And then I'm going to press it down and then press a little bit of solder onto that. And I see it flow, and then I lift. That one, it looks like needs a little bit more. So I'm a little cool, so I'm going to turn up the heat on my soldering iron just a little bit. And again, what you're really looking for here is that it is shiny. And I also like to check the front and the back just to see if a little bit of solder has flowed through the other underside. It will be the top side. That's a good thing. That looks good. So I feel pretty good about that one. I'm going to move on. Now, one sign of a bad joint is if it's a little bit dull gray. That's usually not a good sign. So, yeah, you just want to make sure that it looks nice and shiny. And then I like to clip the lead just to keep my work nice and tidy. And that's a good looking joint right there. So I'm just going to keep moving on, soldering each of these resistors in. Alright, so now I've got all my resistors on and all my capacitors. I did decide to do all the resistors and then solder them up and then move on to doing the capacitors and solder them up. And yeah, pretty easy stuff. Got the leads trimmed on the other side. Let's keep moving forward. Alright, now I got my diodes in. Just remember to match the polarity. The little line matches with the little line. Pretty easy peasy. And I did do another look over just to make sure that none of the little leads that I've put in are touching anything else. I got a couple spots where I had to kind of rebend some of these leads so they were not incidentally contacting one another. Alright, now I got the pots installed on top. Just want to double check with your spec sheets which one goes where. These are really nice because they've got these plastic covers so that they can actually sit like right on top, which is super duper nice. And then the last thing I would recommend is do a once over. Just look through the top of the board here, and you're just looking to see that you see shiny solder. And so everything that I had soldered was on this side. All my solder came in here, and if you're using the correct amount of solder, it will flow down and give you coverage here on this bottom side. So just do a little once over and double check to make sure you've got everything in there too. Okay, now I've got everything assembled on the PCB board. I guess it's PCB. Pots are on the back. These are my in and outputs, in 9-volt, ground, and out. What I'm going to do at this point is actually hook these up, probably just using either a breadboard or maybe some alligator clips, and just test that it works in this current state. No reason going ahead and sticking it in the box before it's ready, before you know that it's working. So we're going to test it at this stage.